Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm Yumna Patel, the Palestine News Director at Mondoweiss, and I'll be your host this week. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. On August 5th, Israel launched a 3-day operation in the besieged Gaza Strip. They dubbed it Operation Breaking Dawn. Israel's acting Prime Minister Yair Lapid promoted the operation as a preemptive strike to quash what he said were concrete threats by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement in Gaza. Over the course of 3 days, 49 Palestinians were killed, including 17 children. According to our documentation, while many PIJ members and affiliates were indeed targeted, the majority of those that were killed were civilian non-combatants. The operation was the second major Israeli offensive on Gaza since last year. It also happened to fall just a few months before Israel's upcoming elections, at a time when Israel's current prime minister and his party are struggling in the polls. In the wake of the attack, many Palestinians accused Israeli officials of using Gazans as sacrificial pawns in their political games, while Lapid and other officials in his government hailed it as a success. Joining us today to discuss Israel's political motivations behind the Gaza attack is Amjad Iraqi, an editor and writer at 972 magazine based in Haifa. He's also a policy analyst at the think tank Al-Shabaka and was previously an advocacy coordinator at the legal center Adalah. Amjad, thanks for joining us.
So much for having me, Yumna.
So Amjad, before we get into the attack on Gaza, I want to frame things a little bit in the larger political landscape in Israel right now. Israel is headed for another round of parliamentary elections in November, and it's the 5th election in 4 years. And from what we can see, it's shaping up to be what could be a triumphant return of former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So I want to ask you, how did we get here to this point? And what have the past few months looked like in Israeli politics leading up to the attack on Gaza?
To kind of zoom out on the Israeli political scene, for the past couple of years, what Israeli politics has primarily been about is basically this internal fight within what we can define as the Israeli Zionist right. Now, of course, there's a sort of a general consensus that exists among all Zionist parties inside Israel, whether it's from the far right to what we regard as like the center left or Zionist left. But for the past couple of years, based on the composition of the parties and based on the polling of large sections of the Israeli public, it's that you could firmly define it according to the Israeli center right, all the way to the far right. And although this is kind of the dominant camp, the biggest political battles that have been going on are actually going on within this camp, almost entirely around a personal conflict vis-a-vis Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister and current opposition leader. Netanyahu, of course, was a longtime prime minister for almost 12 consecutive years, as well as years before. And over those years, many of these different right-wing parties, across the spectrum, have worked with him in some capacity or another. Many of them have even been members of the Likud party that Netanyahu runs. But over the years, for all sorts of reasons, they began to fall out with Netanyahu, or they had significant personal differences with him. Now, many of these parties really share a lot of the same policies, a lot of the same platforms, and don't necessarily disagree ideologically or in a lot of the political strategies that he takes on behalf of the state of Israel. But it's precisely because of that personal conflict with him personally that is creating these big fissures within these parties. And so he finally got to the point where in the past few years, with these kind of multiple incarnations of elections in just the space of 3 years, you finally had last year a very ramshackle coalition that became led by Naftali Bennett as prime minister, but was very much, or the prime architect behind it was Yair Lapid, who kind of represents a sort of center-right party, Yesh Atid, within the spectrum. And the only thing that really cobbled together these parties was either a kind of loathing of Netanyahu personally, or a kind of opportunism by some of the members. So you would literally have someone like Bennett, who is regarded very much on the far right, especially when it comes to Palestinians and concepts of the Jewish state. And Bennett is very unapologetic about his far-right views in that respect, very pro-settlement, etc., ranging all the way to the Islamist Ra'am Party, led by Mansour Abbas, which broke away from the joint list from the other Arab political parties to kind of set his own path with this government, and all these other different factions in between. Now, because it was a very ramshackle coalition, it was always a very tumultuous government, and that kept leading to a very tumultuous collapse as well in June, when it became clear that the government could no longer function, that it wasn't enough just to be anti-Bibi or just to be opportunistic, because they became very significant substantive differences, ironically enough, around Palestinians, especially. Things like the citizenship law, a law that bans family unification, things like a settler emergency law, which enshrines a separate legal system for settlers in the West Bank, at least legally speaking, technically speaking, which, because of all these different fissures, it became more complicated. And that's what ultimately led to this collapse of the government realizing that it couldn't go on any longer. And a lot of these fissures within the coalition was also exploited very much by Netanyahu, who, even though he's opposition leader, really knew how to play on the right-wing views of a lot of the members of the coalition on the right-wing, a largely right-wing public, through racist rhetoric, demonization, and even helping to bring down the government on issues that he would have voted for and enforced. But the fact that he's not prime minister is the only reason why he was going up against it. And now we're coming to this upcoming election with a lot of these different kinds of forms of baggage being brought to the table.
So now let's look at Operation Breaking Dawn. It was pretty clear in the days leading up to August 5th that Israel was gearing up for something in Gaza. Israel imposed roadblocks in the areas around Gaza. It shut down the border crossings into the Strip, and it canceled the permits of thousands of medical patients and workers from Gaza. As we know, the operation started on August 5th and lasted 3 days, killing 49 Palestinians, including 17 children. At the time, it really did seem like a whirlwind. It finished almost as quickly as it started. When comparing it to previous major Israeli operations in Gaza, it was the shortest Israeli offensive. Israel claimed that it was focused on attacking PIJ strongholds in Gaza due to the threats that they posed. But what we've seen over the past few months, since the start of the year, actually, is that a lot of the militant activity from PIJ, when it comes to, in terms of confronting Israel's military apparatus, has actually been coming out of the West Bank, not Gaza. So my first question regarding the operation in Gaza is, why did Israel specifically choose to attack Gaza or launch its operation from Gaza and not the West Bank, for example, to play out this military offensive?
I think the primary reason, to put it very straightforwardly, is that Gaza, and specifically attacks from Gaza, is usually, or let's say it usually hurts Israel more than certain militant activities going on in the West Bank. The core reason for this, we can zoom out, for example, whereby the Israeli military, especially since the beginning of the year, has been having kind of consistent military operations, especially in the northern West Bank around places like Jenin and in Nablus, a bit in Hebron and other parts of the West Bank. And so this has been ongoing for quite a while. Now, the way that the occupation and the apartheid regime function in the West Bank, as I'm sure many of the listeners know, the Israeli army has a very direct presence on the ground. That's not just in Area C, but also in Area A, which is theoretically under the control of the Palestinian Authority. The army can, of course, barge in whenever it wants, launch military incursions whenever it wants, and that's exactly what it's been doing. So it has a very hands-on approach in kind of asserting its control and dealing with militant groups in the West Bank, and that's been going on for quite a while. In Gaza, apartheid exists in a different form, where it's a larger cage, whereby there's no direct Israeli military presence, but Israel, of course, controls the entire surroundings. It's a full-on blockade, full-on siege, and the way that they usually engage there is, oftentimes like a system of collaboration to gather intelligence, within Gaza, but more importantly through like airstrikes and larger military offensives that go on from above. Now, if militants usually decide to launch an attack on Israelis in the West Bank, they'll often target like settlers and settlements. It's much harder for them to do so like inside what is defined as like Israel proper, so inside pre-67 borders. With Gaza, you have rockets basically aiming at Israeli towns and cities, primarily in the south, but sometimes reaching as far as Tel Aviv, as what happened with the recent round. And so this is the case whereby, we want to kind of note, by the way, that, although there was this buildup by the Israelis, the real spark that created this was actually an arrest of a senior Islamic Jihad official, senior Islamic Jihad member in Jenin, like in the northern West Bank, which caused a great deal of concern that if the Islamic Jihad was going to respond, that the most powerful way for it to do so would be through rocket attacks in Gaza. So I think that's one core reason why the Israelis quickly shifted gears without lifting their boots off the West Bank, but to shift their gears very much towards Gaza and thinking about how to respond to that territory.
When we talk about Israeli military operations in Gaza, in the larger sort of political context, there is this idea in Israeli politics of using military operations in Gaza as a way to gain political standings. And that's what, as we know, people said happened this time around with Operation Breaking Dawn. But we also know that it is by no means a new concept. So, why does bombing Gaza, where a population of more than 2 million Palestinians are living under total blockade, why does that have such political weight within the Israeli public? And what is it about this policy that appeals to Israeli voters and perhaps motivates Israeli politicians to launch such operations on Gaza?
I think the answer is actually a bit complex in that regard. Like it's a certain mix of factors. So specifically on this recent round, I think the first and foremost reason why it happened was this sort of mistake and miscalculation by the Israelis when it did arrest the senior Islamic Jihad official in Jenin. That was what really escalated their alarm concern. And it was a misstep, primarily because there was a very violent arrest of that member, and it was also quite publicized of the brutality of that arrest. And so there became this, or a lot of analysts are saying that was starting to kind of boil up a lot of angering both within the party and within the wider public of the extent to which the Israeli military was really carrying out these very egregious offensives. And this is an Islamic Jihad member who is more on the political side than the military side. And so the fact that the army overstepped, I think, really made the state try to kind of cover or try to make up for that with this more aggressive stance, especially towards Gaza. Now, regarding the political nature, it's certainly true that there is a degree of kind of like political posturing when it comes to these offensives on Gaza. When we look at this latest round, yet we have elections coming up, and right now the government is primarily being led by Yair Lapid, this quote-unquote centrist prime minister, and also by Benny Gantz, who's currently serving as defense minister. They're both of the kind of center-right sort of factions. And there's definitely a degree to which you could see that they wanted to use this kind of military operation to at least show Israelis that they're capable of handling what they define as like military confrontations, that they're capable of ensuring Israel's defenses, and that it's not just Netanyahu who can provide Israelis with security. And I think Gantz, as defense minister especially, has been particularly trying to sort of showcase his credentials in this respect. He himself, as defense minister, has been centrally involved in directing a lot of the major offensives over the West Bank for months. Throughout the past decade, he has had very central roles in offensives on Gaza, including 2014, during what was codenamed Operation Protective Edge, one of the most destructive military operations in years. And also the very fact that currently the leading Palestinian NGOs, which have been kind of outlawed as quote-unquote terrorist organizations, were outlawed by an order signed personally by Benny Gantz. So he's very he has a very clear interest in showing these defensive credentials throughout his political career, but also especially ahead of an election. With that said, there's also another important aspect of this, whereby immediately after the operation ended, it was a very quick one. There's been a lot of polling done since then, and what they actually found was that there's been no significant changes in any of the parties' standings. Now, of course, every polling has to be taken with grains of salt, and a lot of Israelis have, in the polls, actually said they were quite satisfied or pleased with Lapid and Gantz's performance during that offensive, but there was no significant shift in balance. And I think this says something very important, and it speaks specifically about the question of indifference in Israeli society when it comes to Palestinians. Now, on the one hand, you certainly have a lot of members of, large segments of the Israeli public, and certainly many of the Israeli parties who have a very sort of almost eliminationist stance when it comes to either Palestinians or Hamas or the Gaza Strip, where they want to kind of destroy the enemy as much as possible. And you see that aggression play out in many respects. But you also have another chunk of Israelis who, it's almost like they don't necessarily need to think about the elimination of Palestinians or in terms of destroying the enemy, but they just want Palestinians out of sight and out of mind. It's almost like Israelis they just don't want to think about Palestinians. They don't care what's going on this other side of the apartheid wall, this other side of the psychological bubble. They don't care what needs to be done as long as Palestinians are kept out of their lives. There's that kind of indifference is, it sounds like a light thing, but it's actually a very violent form of passivity. It's a demand for quiet. It's a demand for silence from Palestinians. And so when Israelis are looking at this operation and they're looking at Lapid and Gantz, they can say, yes, you guys did a good job, and you did a good job in just bringing it back to quiet. But as long as it's brought back to quiet, then we're fine, we're satisfied. So this is a bit of a kind of more complex avenue to this, which is no less alarming, because I think it really shows the depth of the banality of apartheid and the depth of the banality that Israelis are demanding of their leaders, whereby if you're not asking for them to destroy the enemy, you're just asking just to keep them out of your way with few questions asked. And so I think that's partly to explain why there wasn't really any significant polling shift. It always depends, not every operation is the same. The 2014 Gaza offensive is very different from this most recent one. But it's been interesting to see that it did not necessarily make any significant election shifts, whether it was a failure on the politicians' part to make to use it to their advantage, or if Israelis themselves have just gone beyond thinking of Palestinians, or at least segments of Israelis thinking of Palestinians as necessary to have as a constant enemy in order for them to think about their politics.
It's interesting that you bring up the fact that polls in the aftermath of the operation didn't necessarily indicate that, if we're looking at this, from a purely political standpoint, that it was necessarily a huge success. But when the ceasefire was announced, at least, Lapid and other officials did hail it as a success, saying that Israel, quote unquote, achieved its goals, one of which they really emphasized was deterrence measures and, quote, sending a clear message to our enemies. Knowing what you do about the current Israeli political landscape and the upcoming elections, what do you think that the real goals of this operation were? Was it truly, a deterrence measure, an effort to quash PIJ in Gaza? And was the message that Lapid's government trying to send was it a message to Israel's quote unquote enemies, or was it actually a message to the Israeli public? And whether or not the Israeli public has been receptive to that message is a different question.
I think it's certainly both in some respects. And I would bring back to the point that I think this military assault very much happened because of a certain overreach and mistakes and miscalculations by the army. Like I said, when they arrested the Islamic Jihad member in Jenin, but also just like other wider factors. And then the offensive became a way for them to just compensate for those mistakes. So on the one hand, there is indeed this message of deterrence to Islamic Jihad to to tell them that, and this is why they kind of launched what the Israelis defined as a preemptive strike, that rather than necessarily holding and waiting for Islamic Jihad to respond, that the army decided that they were going to hit at senior commanders. Whether there was any strategic value to that on the Israeli side is not the issue. It's more that they just wanted to kind of signal that the Israelis could reach the militant group whenever they wanted to. And a part of this is also kind of complex because it's telling that this offensive was specifically vis-a-vis Islamic Jihad, which I think has a lot more, or takes upon itself a lot more free reign to confront the Israelis as opposed to Hamas. Hamas, of course, are no strangers to dealing in military confrontations with Israel. But since last year, because Hamas is the primary party in charge of Gaza as a government, with different kinds of responsibilities and hence different kinds of blames, and so is almost shackled a little bit in when it can militarily intervene. But there's also a very clear understanding between Hamas and Israel to kind of preserve the status quo. I mean, at the same time that Hamas is posing itself as a resistance and revolutionary group, they're actually also acquiescing to a kind of agreement very similar to the way that Fatah and the Palestinian Authority are doing so in the West Bank. It's not necessarily kind of an alliance of friends, but it's an alliance of mutual interests. And it's a way that Hamas has now pieced itself into the wider structures of the apartheid regime. And Islamic Jihad is not beholden to those sort of things. So this is why there is this kind of message to Islamic Jihad, this message to Hamas to get control and, quote unquote, silence from Gaza, as a lot of Israelis are demanding. And then, like I said, there is that part of the political posturing whereby it became, because of the mistakes, there then became an opportunity for the politicians, Israeli politicians, to show their credentials. A lot of politicians are always very wary about entering into military offensives and wars because you never know how it can go. And especially in the years before Netanyahu, a lot of those offensives turned out quite badly. I'm thinking, for example, of the 2006 war in Lebanon with Hezbollah, which was much larger in scale and a lot more different factors. But it was definitely a way for them to take the opportunity. So there became like this combination of messages, this combination of audiences. And for the most part, the Israeli politicians walked away with what they needed. And of course, that came at the direct lives and costs and homes of Palestinians in Gaza. So whichever way you look at it, they were still, I think like you described, there were these pawns in this game by the Israeli regime and by these kind of wider factors of how to maintain apartheid in all its forms.
Now we're close to 3 weeks out of this operation, and every day we're still learning new information about the human cost of the offensive, and Gazans are still being left to pick up the pieces while Israeli politicians continue to gear up for the upcoming elections in November. You've said that the polls don't necessarily indicate any huge successes or gains for Lapid and his party after this operation. So I want to ask you, how do you see things potentially playing out over the next few months leading up to the November elections? And could we potentially see another show of military strength and political posturing on part of the Lapid government, perhaps this time in the West Bank? Or do you think that after the operation in Gaza, they might switch gears and avoid military confrontations altogether leading up to the elections?
Israeli politics never fails to surprise, and it's certainly one of the most unpredictable political scenes around. Right now, the different parties are slowly putting together their lists, on the rankings, who's like first and second and third on the seat, etc. And by September 15th, if I'm not mistaken, they should be submitting those lists. So it's in the kind of like the technical self-organizational stage among these different parties. Like I said, the polling has not shown any significant shifts in regards to what we can define as sort of like the pro and anti-Netanyahu camps. They're kind of neck and neck, and and by all accounts, it could go in many different directions. And these are questions that could be, dissolved down to one single seat, depending on, what they all receive come election day on November 1st. The key questions that might, barring any other major kind of political or military crises of some form, the two key political questions are revolving around kind of two main segments on the Israeli political scene. One is what is going to happen with the supporters of Yamina, the party that was led by Bennett, who was prime minister, and where those different voters are going to go. Some think they might go to Likud, some think they might go to Benny Gantz's party, others think they might go towards Itamar Ben-Gvir's party called Jewish Power, which is a very fascistic, openly fascistic party to the far right. So this might kind of reshape, again, some internal postures within the right-wing camp, and even though they'll stay on the right wing, it'll be determined. We have yet to see whether it falls into the pro and Bibi camp, pro or anti-Bibi camp, and even then, those camps are not necessarily solid. We've seen many times many right-wing politicians who openly despise Netanyahu ultimately ally with him. People like Benny Gantz have done this, and so on and so forth. So it's very unpredictable and could be just down to these Israeli political elites. And the second very important question in all this is actually the voter turnout of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, who make up about 20% of the population. Now, there's almost like a weird paradox in this respect, because even though Palestinian citizens have the right to vote, there's a whole structure of laws and policies in place to make Palestinian citizens second class. And even when you do get political power, even in the parliament, there are also many means to kind of put you in place and to block you from making any meaningful change, as well as all kinds of racist and aggressive rhetoric directed against them. Now, what we've seen, in the past year was, as I mentioned, this breakup of the joint list, this united slate of the Arab political parties, which not too long ago had held 15 seats in the Knesset and was roundly dismissed. Then they broke up with the Islamist Ra'am going on its own, and Mansour Abbas, for a host of reasons, decided to enter into an alliance with these parties. And he's not necessarily pro or anti-Netanyahu, but he is looking for this seat in government. Now, the past year has actually brought quite a mixed bag in terms of how Palestinian citizens are looking at the political parties. On the one hand, there's a large amount of disillusionment with the parties that make up the joint list, because they've now become, in effect, a very powerless opposition faction yet again, and now with 6 seats instead of the 15 that they once had, and just an all-around kind of disgruntlement with the way that their votes don't mean anything, which has been the case in many respects. But I think after the joint list experiment, that crash really affected many people. And the other is how people are reflecting on Mansour Abbas's experience. There are some who firmly believe that Mansour Abbas really revolutionized Arab politics in Israel by joining the government and tried to bring things forward and tried to bring some advances for Palestinian citizens. But there's also a lot of people in the public who are actually seeing that it did not amount to any good. Mansour Abbas actually, and the Ra'am party more generally, broke a lot of its own principles vis-a-vis its own public when it came to either like voting for or abstaining on things like the citizenship law or the settler emergency law, just so they could remain in government. And to be honest, it's a little hard to gauge exactly where most of the opinion is at, and it's still being very widely debated and discussed. And on top of all this is whether or not Palestinian citizens will even come out to vote. A few years ago, I think it was estimated there might have been about 70+% of Palestinian citizens who came out to vote, primarily for the joint list. I think in the last round, there's maybe about 50-something%. And there are some predictions that the turnout might go down as far as the 30-something% maybe. Again, it's hard to know until election day. And this is significant because Ra'am currently holds 4 seats, and it was their seats that helped to enable sustainment of this kind of government of change led by Lapid and Bennett. If those 4 seats go, or if the Arab political parties don't manage to enter the Knesset at all, or hardly enough, then a lot of the power in the Knesset then sort of filters out to the other parties, which are primarily right-wing. And then that can completely determine the fate of what government is imposed, or which powers get more of a bump because of the absence of Palestinian citizens. So there's a real debate going on within the community on their terms before even getting to Israeli political terms of what Palestinian citizens want to do and how they want to play and what is their most important strategic goal in all this. Do they see a path for joining government? Do they no longer want to participate in the government or in the states? These are longstanding questions that are going to be very sharply shown come November 1st.
I think it's important to point out to our listeners, and it's a fact that many people are aware of, which is that when we talk about Israeli elections and the clear role that the lives of Palestinians play in determining the outcome of elections, the vast majority of Palestinians, and that's the millions of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, have no say in Israeli elections and the policies that dictate the trajectory of their lives. And as you pointed out, even the Palestinian citizens of Israel who can vote are actively marginalized in an effort to sideline them from the political process and from actually having the ability to truly challenge Israel's apartheid regime and policies that oppress them every single day.
Absolutely. It all comes down to this larger structure of apartheid, which is inherently a very complex structure, but with a very simple goal. And it is ultimately to maintain the supremacy of Jewish Israelis and even the rights of Jews abroad through things like the law of return, to ensure their superior rights in the official state of Israel, but throughout the occupied territories as well, which for all intents and purposes, this is one single regime. And it operates differently whether you're a refugee or in Gaza, in the West Bank, or inside 48, inside Israel. But that singular purpose remains even with the hierarchy. That's, in the end, should be the primary question when we think about Israeli elections. Yes, there are a lot of complexities and nuances within the political scene, and every shade matters and every seat matters in many respects. But in the grand scheme of the Israeli regime itself, which is a regime of apartheid driven by a settler colonial ideology, that regime will remain. That regime is still part of the consensus of Israeli politics. It's why Palestinian citizens are so aggressively excluded. It's why Palestinians who are not citizens are aggressively subjugated under military rule or forcibly kept in exile. And that ultimately should be where the center of focus should always lie.
Amjad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Yumna. It's great to be on.
Thanks for listening to our show. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.